What if the difference between life and death in the skies above Korea came down to a device that most pilots initially refused to trust? What if the technological edge that would define jet combat for decades was nearly abandoned because seasoned aviators believed their eyes and instincts were superior to a piece of glass and electronics? In the frozen winter of 1952, American F-86 Sabre pilots were dying, not in droves but steadily, predictably against an enemy that should have been inferior. The Soviet-built MiG-15 was supposed to be the underdog in this aerial chess match, yet it was holding its own, and in some engagements, it was winning. The pilots flying these silver jets over the bleak landscape of North Korea knew something had to change. They just didn't know that salvation would come in a form they would initially reject. This is the story of the A1CM computing gunsight, a revolutionary piece of technology that transformed air combat almost overnight. It's a story about the clash between tradition and innovation, about men who had to unlearn everything they knew about shooting down enemy aircraft, and about how a device no bigger than a shoebox became one of the most significant force multipliers in aviation history. The secret sight that changed MiG Alley forever wasn't secret because it was classified. It was secret because those who needed it most didn't want to believe in it. The Korean War's aerial battleground would become the proving ground for technologies that would shape air combat for generations. But before the A1CM could dominate the skies, it had to overcome something far more challenging than enemy fighters, the stubborn pride of the very pilots it was designed to save. November 1950 marked a turning point in aerial warfare that few anticipated. When United Nations forces, primarily American, first encountered the MiG-15 over the skies of North Korea, they faced a rude awakening. The communist jet fighter was faster at high altitude than anything the Americans could field, except the F-86 Sabre. It could climb better, it had a higher service ceiling, and its armament of two 23 meters and one 37mm cannons packed a devastating punch that could tear an aircraft apart with a single burst. The Sabre, by contrast, carried 6 .50 caliber machine guns, weapons that seemed almost quaint by comparison. Yet the Sabre had advantages of its own: better control at high speeds, superior pilot visibility, and most importantly, it was being flown by experienced American pilots, many of whom were veterans of World War II. These men had cut their teeth in Mustangs and Thunderbolts, where deflection shooting, the art of leading a moving target with instinctive calculations of speed, distance, and angle, was the mark of an ace. The region that would become known as MiG Alley stretched along the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. This narrow corridor of sky, roughly 100 miles long and 25 miles wide, became the most contested airspace in the world. Here, American Sabres dueled with MiG-15s in swirling dogfights that reached altitudes of 50,000 feet and speeds approaching the sound barrier. The stakes were absolute. Control of the air meant the ability to support ground troops, interdict enemy supply lines, and protect vulnerable bombers. Lose that control, and the entire war effort could collapse. By late 1951, the kill ratios favored the Americans, but not by the margin that superior training should have provided. The official figures would later claim ratios of 10.1 or even higher, but pilots in the thick of combat knew the truth was more sobering. The MiG-15 was a formidable opponent, and the Chinese and North Korean pilots, while often less experienced, were learning quickly. Soviet pilots, flying under strict orders not to communicate in Russian over the radio, were also entering the fray, bringing with them the hard-won lessons of the Eastern Front in World War II. The problem wasn't courage or skill. American pilots were among the best in the world. The problem was hitting the target. At the speeds of jet combat, everything happened faster than the human brain could fully process. A MiG-15 traveling at 600 miles per hour covered nearly 900 feet every second. In a turning fight, with both aircraft maneuvering violently, calculating the proper lead, the point ahead of the target where bullets and aircraft would meet, required not just skill, but near supernatural prescience. Traditional gun sights, even the gyroscopic sights introduced late in World War II, couldn't keep up with these new realities. They required pilots to manually estimate range, and then apply that estimate to a computing mechanism that would adjust the sight picture. Under the stress of combat, with a MiG filling the windscreen and tracer rounds from enemy fighters streaking past the canopy, this manual process was failing. Ammunition was being wasted, opportunities were being lost, and pilots were returning to base frustrated, knowing they had gotten good shots that simply didn't connect. Into this crucible of need stepped a device that had been under development since the closing days of World War II. The A1CM computing gunsight, produced by the Sperry Gyroscope Company, represented a quantum leap in fire control technology. Unlike earlier sights, the A1CM used radar ranging to automatically compute the correct lead angle for hitting a maneuvering target. It removed the guesswork, the estimation, and the desperate mental calculations that had defined air combat since the First World War. The sight consisted of several components working in concert. A small ranging radar mounted in the nose of the F-86 measured the exact distance to the target aircraft. This information fed into an analog computer that factored in the Sabre's own speed and angle of attack, the rate of turn, and dozens of other variables. The result was projected onto a combining glass in front of the pilot's eyes as a continuously adjusting reticle, a sight picture that moved in real time, showing exactly where to aim for a killing shot. In theory, it was revolutionary. In practice, it was about to face its harshest critics, the pilots themselves. The story of computing gunsights begins not in Korea, but in the skies over Europe and the Pacific during World War II. The problem of deflection shooting had bedeviled fighter pilots since the dawn of air combat. In the First World War, pilots had fired along the longitudinal axis of their aircraft, requiring them to point their entire plane at where they thought the enemy would be. This intuitive method worked for close-range, low-speed encounters, but it was woefully inadequate as aircraft became faster and combat ranges increased. By World War II, fixed ring and bead sights had evolved into more sophisticated gyroscopic systems. The British developed the Mark II gyro gun sight, which American engineers refined into the K-14 sight used in late-war P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. These sights represented a significant advancement. A pilot would estimate the target's range and wingspan, input those values into the sight, and the gyroscopic mechanism would automatically compute and display the proper lead angle based on the aircraft's turning rate. The results were impressive. Pilots using gyro gun sights in the final year of World War II reported significantly higher hit ratios than those using fixed sights. The legendary ace George Preddy, flying a P-51 with a K-14 sight, demonstrated the system's potential by shooting down 6 German fighters in a single mission. But the gyro sight had a fatal flaw. It still required accurate range estimation by the pilot. Under combat stress, with adrenaline flooding the system and the target maneuvering violently, pilots consistently misestimated range, sometimes by hundreds of yards. A sight computation based on incorrect range data was useless, or worse, actively misleading. The solution was obvious: remove the human from the range-finding equation. Radar technology, which had won the Battle of Britain and revolutionized naval warfare, offered the answer. If a small radar unit could automatically measure the distance to a target aircraft, the gunsight computer could calculate perfect firing solutions without requiring any estimation from the pilot. The concept was sound, but the technology in 1945 was barely capable of delivering on the promise. Early radar ranging systems were bulky, unreliable, and prone to interference. The radar sets were temperamental devices that required careful tuning and frequent maintenance. When they worked, they were miraculous. When they failed, which was often, they left pilots with a dark sight and a sense of betrayal. The first operational radar-ranging gunsights appeared in the final months of World War II, but the war ended before they could be properly evaluated in combat. The post-war years saw steady refinement. The Sperry Gyroscope Company, which had made its name producing bomb sights and fire control systems, took the lead in developing what would become the A1CM. The company's engineers worked to miniaturize the components, improve reliability, and integrate the system seamlessly with the new generation of jet fighters then entering service. The A1CM that emerged from this development process was a marvel of analog engineering. Thousands of components including resistors, capacitors, servo motors, and precision gears, all working together to solve ballistic equations in real time. When the F-86 Sabre entered service in 1949, it was designed from the outset to accommodate the A1CM sight. The radar ranging unit, designated the AN/APG-30, was mounted in the upper lip of the Sabre's nose intake, a location that provided an unobstructed view forward while not interfering with the engine's airflow. The computing unit was installed in the nose, just behind the radar, with wiring running back to the cockpit, where the combining glass was mounted on the windscreen frame. The Air Force was enthusiastic. Here was a fire control system that promised to multiply the effectiveness of every fighter pilot, to turn average shooters into marksmen and good shooters into aces. Initial testing at Edwards Air Force Base and other facilities showed remarkable results. In controlled conditions, pilots using the A1CM were hitting aerial targets at rates 3 to 4 times higher than pilots using manual sights. The computers didn't lie. The A1CM worked. But controlled testing and combat are worlds apart. When the first F-86 equipped with the A1CM arrived in Korea in late 1951, they encountered a reception that ranged from skepticism to outright hostility. The pilots of the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing, the primary Sabre unit in theater, were experienced combat veterans. Many had multiple kills already. They had learned to shoot using their eyes, their instincts, and hard-won experience. They knew how to lead a target, how to judge deflection, how to squeeze the trigger at precisely the right moment. And now some rear echelon engineers were telling them to trust a machine, to ignore their instincts and follow a glowing pip on a piece of glass. The very suggestion seemed absurd, even insulting. These were fighter pilots, members of an elite fraternity that valued skill, courage, and individual ability above all else. The idea that a computer could do their job better than they could struck at the heart of their identity. Colonel Francis Gabreski, a World War II ace commanding the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing, spoke for many when he expressed doubts about the new sight. Gabreski had 28 confirmed kills from World War II, achieved through masterful deflection shooting and aggressive tactics. He trusted his own eyes and his own calculations. The A1CM, with its radar ranging and automatic computations, seemed like a crutch for pilots who hadn't developed proper shooting skills. Other objections were more practical. The early A1CM units were indeed prone to failure. The radar ranging system could be fooled by ground clutter, by chaff dropped by enemy aircraft, or by the target maneuvering in certain ways. When the sight failed during a critical moment, and it sometimes did, pilots found themselves with no backup aiming reference, having not developed proficiency with the Sabre's backup fixed sight. This created a dangerous situation. Pilots who had become dependent on the computing sight were helpless when it malfunctioned. There were also concerns about maintenance. The A1CM was a complex piece of equipment that required specialized knowledge to service and repair. Forward airfields in Korea, operating under primitive conditions with limited resources, were not ideal environments for delicate electronics. Maintenance crews, already overburdened with keeping the jets flying in harsh winter conditions, viewed the computing sight as another system that could break and require hours of troubleshooting. The cultural resistance went deeper still. Fighter aviation had always celebrated the individual ace, the pilot whose skill and daring set him apart from his peers. The idea that technology could equalize performance, that an average pilot with an A1CM might shoot as well as a naturally gifted pilot without one, threatened the established hierarchy. If a computer could make anyone a good shot, what did that say about the special abilities of the aces? This tension between individual skill and technological enhancement was not new to warfare. Similar debates had occurred when breech-loading rifles replaced muzzle loaders, when machine guns challenged the dominance of aimed rifle fire, when bomb sights made precision bombing possible for average bombardiers. Each time, there were voices insisting that technology degraded the warrior's craft, that it removed the human element that defined combat excellence, and each time, those voices were eventually drowned out by the reality that wars are won by those who most effectively employ the best available tools. But in the winter of 1951-52, that reality had not yet become apparent in the skies over Korea. The A1CM remained controversial, underutilized, and widely mistrusted. It would take a crisis to change minds, and that crisis was approaching fast. The breaking point came in February 1952, during a particularly intense period of air combat over MiG Alley, a large formation of communist bombers, escorted by numerous MiG-15 fighters, attempted a daylight raid on United Nations positions. The 4th Fighter Wing scrambled every available Sabre to intercept. In the massive engagement that followed, something became painfully clear. The pilots who were consistently achieving kills were those who had embraced the A1CM and learned to use it effectively. Captain Robinson Risner, flying his third combat tour, exemplified the transition. Risner had been skeptical of the computing sight initially, preferring to rely on the deflection shooting skills he had honed through hundreds of hours of practice. But during this engagement, he watched as younger, less experienced pilots achieved kill after kill by trusting the A1CM, while he struggled to connect with manual methods. In the middle of the furball, with MiGs swirling in every direction, Risner made a conscious decision to trust the sight completely. He forced himself to ignore his instincts about lead angles and simply position his aircraft where the computing sight told him to aim. The results were immediate and dramatic. Risner's first burst with the A1CM guidance struck a MiG-15 squarely in the fuselage, sending it spiraling downward, trailing fire. His second engagement was equally successful. By the end of the mission, Risner had achieved 2 confirmed kills and 1 probable, his best single mission performance in 3 tours of combat. The experience converted him from skeptic to believer instantly. Upon landing, he sought out other veteran pilots and told them bluntly, "Use the sight or die trying to prove you don't need it." Stories like Risner's began to circulate through the fighter wings. Pilots compared notes in the officers' clubs, trading experiences and techniques. A consensus emerged: the A1CM worked, but only if you committed to it completely. Half-hearted use, constantly second-guessing the sight and reverting to manual estimation, produced worse results than either method alone. The sight demanded trust, discipline, and a willingness to fundamentally change how you approached air combat. The fundamental concept behind the A1CM computing gun sight touched on several core principles of aerial combat that had been understood since the earliest days of fighter aviation, but never fully solved. At its heart was the problem of deflection, how to aim at a point in space where a moving target will be at the precise moment bullets reach that location, accounting for the motion of both attacker and target, the ballistic trajectory of the projectiles, and the 3-dimensional geometry of the engagement. Human beings are not naturally equipped to solve these problems at jet speeds. Our brains evolved to track targets moving at the speeds of game animals or thrown objects, dozens of miles per hour at most. We can learn to lead targets through practice and develop intuitions about where to aim, but these abilities break down as speeds increase. At 600 miles per hour, the margin for error becomes so small that even experienced pilots miss far more often than they hit. The mathematics of deflection shooting are actually straightforward in principle, if complex in execution. To hit a target, bullets must arrive at a specific point in space at the same instant the target occupies that point. Since bullets are not instantaneous, the firing solution must account for time of flight, the seconds required for projectiles to travel from gun muzzle to impact point. During that time of flight, the target continues moving, so the aim point must be ahead of the target's current position by a distance equal to the target's speed multiplied by time of flight. But it gets more complicated. The attacking aircraft is also moving, and its motion affects the trajectory of the bullets. Bullets fired from a moving aircraft inherit the velocity of that aircraft, creating a complex vector that must be added to the bullet's own velocity. If the attacking aircraft is in a turn, centrifugal force affects the bullet trajectory. If the engagement is not in level flight, gravity must be factored in. Air density, which varies with altitude, affects both aircraft performance and bullet trajectory. Temperature affects powder burn rates and thus muzzle velocity. A complete firing solution requires considering dozens of variables simultaneously and producing an answer in fractions of a second, continuously updated as both aircraft maneuver. No human can perform these calculations consciously during combat. Successful deflection shooting by pilots using manual sights was actually a combination of pattern recognition, learned approximation, and luck. Experienced pilots developed intuitions about how much to lead different targets in different situations, but these intuitions were imperfect and broke down under the novel conditions of jet combat. The A1CM removed all of this guesswork and approximation. The radar ranging unit provided precise continuous range data, not an estimate, but an exact measurement updated multiple times per second. The analog computer, fed with this ranging data, along with inputs from the aircraft's own sensors measuring speed, angle of attack and turn rate, solved the ballistic equations continuously. The output was a moving reticle that showed the pilot exactly where to aim for a hit, updated in real time as the tactical situation changed. The beauty of the system was its simplicity from the pilot's perspective. Instead of having to estimate range, calculate lead, and adjust for dozens of factors, the pilot simply had to accomplish two tasks: keep the target within the radar's tracking cone so the ranging system could lock on, and maneuver the aircraft to place the computed aiming point on the target. When those two conditions were met, radar locked, pipper on target, pulling the trigger virtually guaranteed hits. This represented a fundamental shift in what it meant to be a fighter pilot. The emphasis moved from individual shooting skill to tactical positioning and energy management. A pilot who could maneuver his aircraft into a favorable position and then hold it steady, while the computing sight did its work, would be more effective than a naturally gifted shot who relied on instinct but couldn't hold proper position. The A1CM didn't make shooting irrelevant. It changed what shooting meant. The sight also altered the economics of aerial combat. In traditional dogfighting, pilots often expended hundreds or even thousands of rounds to achieve a single kill. The 50 caliber machine guns in the F-86 carried about 1,800 rounds total, representing perhaps 15-20 seconds of continuous firing time. In the heat of combat, with targets appearing and disappearing in moments, pilots would hold the trigger down for extended bursts, hosing ammunition in the general direction of the enemy in hopes that some rounds would connect. This was wasteful, but understandable given the difficulty of precise shooting. With the A1CM, ammunition efficiency increased dramatically. Pilots who trusted the sight found they could achieve kills with short, precise bursts of fewer than 100 rounds. Some aces reported kills with bursts of 50 rounds or less. This meant a Sabre could potentially engage multiple targets on a single mission instead of exhausting its ammunition on the first engagement. It meant more enemy aircraft destroyed per sortie, more pressure on enemy pilots, and greater air superiority for fewer resources expended. The technological principles behind the A1CM would prove foundational for all subsequent air combat systems. The concept of using radar ranging to feed a fire control computer became standard in every fighter aircraft that followed. Modern fighters use digital computers millions of times more powerful, with radar systems that can track multiple targets simultaneously and display firing solutions with perfect precision. But the basic architecture, radar ranging, computational fire control, integrated display, was established by the A1CM in the skies over Korea. Yet the site's most important contribution might have been psychological rather than technical. By demonstrating that electronic systems could outperform human estimation in certain critical tasks, the A1CM opened the door for increasing automation in combat aircraft. The path from the A1CM to modern fly-by-wire systems, heads-up displays and computer-assisted targeting is direct and clear. Each system represents a further step in the same direction, using technology to handle tasks that human beings cannot perform as effectively, freeing pilots to focus on tactical decision-making and mission execution. This automation has always been controversial. There remains even today a strain of thought in military aviation that views increasing automation as degrading pilot skill and removing the human element that defines air combat. But the evidence from Korea onward has been consistent. Properly designed automation makes pilots more effective, not less. It doesn't replace skill. It changes which skills matter most and raises the baseline performance of all pilots to levels that only exceptional individuals could previously achieve. The integration of the A1CM into combat doctrine also revealed important truths about how technology changes tactical thinking. Traditional fighter tactics had been built around the limitations of manual deflection shooting. Pilots were taught to close to very short range where lead angles were smaller and easier to estimate. They were taught to take snapshots at fleeting opportunities because holding a steady tracking position was nearly impossible in violent maneuvering. They were taught to spray ammunition liberally because precision was difficult to achieve. The A1CM inverted many of these assumptions. The sight worked best at moderate ranges, where the radar could track reliably, but bullets still had sufficient velocity and trajectory. It rewarded smooth, sustained tracking over violent maneuvering and snap shooting. It encouraged ammunition discipline, because precise fire control made every round count. Pilots who adapted their tactics to exploit these characteristics found themselves far more effective than those who tried to use the A1CM within traditional tactical frameworks. This required not just learning new techniques, but unlearning old ones. Experienced pilots had to consciously suppress instincts developed over hundreds of hours of flying. They had to trust the sight even when it contradicted their gut feelings about where to aim. They had to remain patient and hold tracking positions that felt unnatural. This cognitive restructuring was perhaps the most difficult aspect of adopting the A1CM, more challenging than any technical aspect of operating the system. The sight's effectiveness also depended heavily on proper maintenance and calibration. The analog computing mechanisms required precise alignment, and the radar ranging system needed careful tuning to operate at peak performance. A poorly maintained A1CM could be worse than no sight at all, providing incorrect firing solutions that would cause pilots to miss consistently. This placed enormous pressure on ground crews to keep the systems operating correctly, despite harsh field conditions. Maintenance officers developed increasingly sophisticated diagnostic procedures to identify and correct A1CM problems. They learned to recognize the symptoms of various failures. A sight that wouldn't lock indicated radar problems. Erratic pipper movement suggested gyro issues. Consistent misses to one side meant calibration drift. The learning curve for maintaining the A1CM was steep, but as crews gained experience, reliability improved dramatically. The enemy also adapted to the presence of computing gun sights on American fighters. Intelligence reports indicated that MiG pilots were briefed on the A1CM's characteristics and trained in countermeasures. They learned to make sudden, unpredictable maneuvers designed to break radar lock. They learned to stay at the edges of the sight's effective range envelope. They learned to recognize when a Sabre had achieved a good tracking position and was likely using the computing sight effectively, prompting more desperate, evasive action. This tactical evolution created a new dynamic in air combat. The A1CM gave American pilots a significant advantage, but that advantage could be mitigated by skilled opponents using appropriate countermeasures. The sight didn't guarantee victory. It simply shifted the odds significantly in favor of the pilot who possessed it. In the hands of a skilled, well-trained pilot using sound tactics, the A1CM was devastating. In the hands of a poorly trained pilot using bad tactics, it was merely helpful. The breakthrough came not from official channels or training programs, but from combat necessity and the empirical evidence that couldn't be ignored. Several factors converged in early 1952 to finally overcome the resistance to the A1CM and demonstrate its decisive advantages. The first factor was the arrival of new pilots in theater who had been trained on the A1CM from the beginning. These pilots, fresh from stateside training squadrons, had never developed the deeply ingrained habits of manual deflection shooting that made the computing sight seem unnatural to veteran pilots. They were taught from day one to trust the sight, to focus on proper positioning and letting the computer handle the ballistics. When these pilots began achieving kills on their early missions, kills that would typically take months of experience to attain, the veterans began to take notice. Second Lieutenant James Jabara, who would become the first American jet ace, exemplified the transition. Jabara was a World War II veteran with combat experience, but he recognized immediately that jet combat was different. When he was introduced to the A1CM in training, he devoted himself to mastering the system. His approach was methodical. Position the aircraft properly, wait for the radar to lock, place the computed pipper on the target, and fire short, controlled bursts. In May 1951, flying F-86 equipped with the computing sight, Jabara scored his 5th and 6th kills, becoming the first ace of the jet age. His success wasn't luck or exceptional reflexes, it was disciplined application of the A1CM's capabilities. The second factor was improved reliability. Sperry engineers, receiving feedback from the field, made continuous improvements to the A1CM system. Early problems with the radar ranging unit's susceptibility to ground clutter were largely solved by improved signal processing. The analog computer was ruggedized to better handle the vibrations and temperature extremes of combat operations. Maintenance procedures were refined and better training provided to ground crews. By early 1952, the A1CM's reliability had improved dramatically, reducing the failure rate that had fueled pilot skepticism. The third and most important factor was the mounting evidence of the sight's effectiveness. Fighter squadrons kept detailed records of every combat engagement, rounds expended, hits claimed, damage observed, and outcomes. When analysts began carefully comparing the performance of pilots using the A1CM versus those relying on manual sights, the differences were stark and undeniable. Pilots using the computing sight were achieving kill ratios several times higher than those using manual methods. They were expending dramatically less ammunition per kill. They were achieving lethal damage with shorter engagement times, reducing their own vulnerability to enemy fire. One particularly convincing analysis compared the performance of individual pilots before and after transitioning to full reliance on the A1CM. The same pilot, flying the same aircraft against the same opposition, would see his effectiveness increase by factors of 2, 3, or even 4, simply by trusting the computing site instead of his own estimates. This eliminated variables about individual skill or favorable matchups. The difference was the sight, and the difference was impossible to dismiss. Wing commanders, seeing these results, began to mandate A1CM proficiency. Pilots were ordered to use the computing site on combat missions and to practice with it relentlessly during training sorties. Instructors in theater developed new tactics specifically designed to exploit the site's capabilities. The focus shifted to maneuvers that would bring the Sabre into the optimal firing position, the 6 o'clock position directly behind the target at close range, and then hold it there long enough for the radar to lock and the sight to produce a firing solution. The tactical doctrine that emerged around the A1CM emphasized patience and precision over aggressive maneuvering. The old-school approach to dogfighting valued aggressive turns, rapid positioning changes, and quick snapshots at fleeting opportunities. The A1CM rewarded a different approach: smooth, controlled maneuvering that kept the target within the radar's acquisition cone, stable platform shooting that allowed the computing site to track continuously, and disciplined trigger control that used ammunition efficiently. This new doctrine particularly favored engagements against the MiG-15's weaknesses. The Soviet fighter was superior to the Sabre in climb rate and ceiling, but it was less stable at high speeds, and its controls became heavy and sluggish in high-speed maneuvers. Sabre pilots learned to force engagements into the speed regime where their aircraft was superior, to maneuver smoothly to stay within the A1CM's tracking parameters, and to press attacks with confidence that their computing site would produce hits if they did their part. The site also changed the dynamics of defensive combat. When a Sabre pilot found himself defensive, being pursued by a MiG, the traditional response was violent evasive maneuvering, hard brakes, rolling scissors, anything to spoil the enemy's tracking solution. But pilots discovered that the A1CM made offensive shooting much easier for their pursuers if the target maneuvered predictably. This led to the development of new defensive tactics that involved rapid, random changes in flight path designed to break the enemy's radar lock. The computing site was so effective that preventing it from working became as important as employing it effectively yourself. Training evolved to incorporate these new realities. Pilots spent hours in practice engagements learning the A1CM's quirks and capabilities. They learned the site's tracking limits, how hard the aircraft could pull before the radar lost lock, how close they could safely close before minimum range prevented effective tracking. They learned to recognize the difference between a marginal lock and a solid lock, to feel when the site was giving them a good solution versus a questionable one. This experiential knowledge transformed the A1CM from a mysterious black box into a trusted tool that pilots understood deeply. The psychological transformation was as important as the technical mastery. Pilots who had initially viewed the A1CM with suspicion or contempt came to rely on it completely. They developed confidence in the site's accuracy that translated into more aggressive tactics. Knowing that their shooting was deadly accurate when using the A1CM properly, pilots pressed attacks more persistently and took shots they would have passed up with manual sights. This aggressiveness, backed by the technical superiority of the computing site, created a psychological advantage that demoralized enemy pilots. The results in MiG Alley were dramatic and swift. In early 1952, the 4th Fighter Wing, the first unit to fully embrace the A1CM, saw its kill ratio against MiG-15 spike dramatically. Engagements that had previously been inconclusive, with both sides maneuvering and firing without decisive result, were now ending quickly, with MiGs tumbling from the sky, trailing smoke and flame. The psychological impact on the enemy pilots was significant. The communist pilots began to realize that engaging F-86 was far more dangerous than it had been just months earlier, leading to more cautious tactics and reduced aggressiveness. Individual pilots who embraced the A1CM became extraordinarily effective. Captain Joseph McConnell, who would become the top American ace of the war with 16 confirmed kills, credited the computing site as the single most important factor in his success. McConnell was not a naturally exceptional shot, but he was methodical and disciplined in his approach to combat. He mastered the A1CM through countless hours of practice, learning exactly how to position his aircraft for optimal sight performance. In combat, he was patient, waiting for perfect setup before firing, then using short, precise bursts that rarely missed. Another ace, Major James Johnson, described the A1CM as transformative. Johnson had struggled to achieve kills early in his tour, despite being an experienced pilot. After fully committing to the computing sight and receiving specialized training on its use, he became one of the most effective pilots in the theater. Johnson's experience illustrated a crucial point. The A1CM didn't just help naturally talented pilots, it raised the performance ceiling for everyone who learned to use it properly. By mid-1952, the A1CM was no longer controversial among Sabre pilots. It was standard equipment, universally used, and central to tactics and training. Pilots who had been skeptics became converts after seeing the results in combat. The sight had proven itself in the most demanding crucible, real air combat against a capable enemy. The doubts about reliability had been largely overcome through improved engineering. The concerns about degrading pilot skill had been answered by results that showed the sight made good pilots better, not worse. The final validation came in the form of enemy intelligence. American forces recovered documents from downed North Korean and Chinese aircraft that showed enemy pilots had been briefed on the F-86's computing gunsight. They were warned that American fighters could achieve hits at ranges and angles that seemed impossible, that they should avoid presenting stable tracking solutions, and that the margin between success and death when fighting F-86s was smaller than ever before. The enemy knew about the A1CM, feared it, and altered their tactics to try to counter it. There could be no clearer evidence of its effectiveness. The widespread adoption of the A1CM also sparked innovation in other areas of air combat technology. Recognizing the value of automated fire control, the Air Force accelerated development of even more advanced systems for future fighters. The lessons learned from the A1CM informed the design of the fire control systems for the F-100 Super Sabre, the F-101 Voodoo, and eventually the F-4 Phantom. Each generation of fighter incorporated more sophisticated computing, more capable radar, and more seamless integration between the pilot and the aircraft systems. The maintenance and support infrastructure for the A1CM also evolved rapidly. Specialized technical schools were established to train maintenance personnel on the intricacies of the system. Improved diagnostic equipment made troubleshooting faster and more accurate. Supply chains were optimized to ensure critical components were always available. The Air Force learned that fielding advanced technology required not just the equipment itself, but a comprehensive support system to keep it functioning in harsh field conditions. The story of the A1CM's adoption in Korea raises profound questions about innovation, institutional resistance, and the nature of military effectiveness. Why did a system with such clear advantages face such strong initial resistance? What does this tell us about how militaries adapt to technological change? And what were the longer-term consequences, both positive and negative, of the computing gunsight's success? The resistance to the A1CM was not simply irrational stubbornness, though elements of that were certainly present. Much of the skepticism was rooted in legitimate concerns about reliability and the dangers of overdependence on complex technology. In combat aviation, equipment failure can mean death, and any system that introduces new failure modes deserves scrutiny. The early A1CM units did have reliability problems, and pilots who experienced sight failures at critical moments had good reason to be wary. There was also a legitimate philosophical question about skill degradation. When a technological system automates a task that pilots previously performed manually, there is a real risk that the manual skill will atrophy. If the automated system then fails, pilots may find themselves unable to perform the task manually with the proficiency they once had. This is not a hypothetical concern. It has been documented across many domains where automation has replaced human skill. The challenge is distinguishing between skills worth preserving and skills that are simply obsolete. The deflection shooting skills that A1CM made less critical were, by any objective measure, obsolete in jet combat. The speeds and ranges involved had already exceeded what human estimation could handle effectively. Pilots who achieved success with manual methods were statistical outliers whose natural gifts allowed them to succeed where average pilots could not. The A1CM didn't degrade a universally held skill. It replaced a skill that few pilots possessed at a high level with a system that could give all pilots equivalent performance. But the deeper resistance was cultural and psychological. Fighter pilots occupied and still occupy a unique place in military culture. They are the closest modern equivalent to the knights of medieval warfare, individual warriors whose personal skill and courage determine outcomes. The introduction of technology that diminished the importance of individual skill threatened this identity. If success in air combat became more about mastering a technological system than about innate ability and hard-won experience, what did that mean for the fighter pilot's place in the military hierarchy? This tension between human agency and technological determinism runs through the entire history of warfare. Each major technological innovation, the stirrup, the longbow, gunpowder, the machine gun, the tank, the nuclear weapon, has raised questions about whether warfare was becoming more or less dependent on human factors. In each case, the technology changed what kinds of human factors mattered, but never eliminated human importance entirely. The A1CM didn't make fighter pilots irrelevant. It changed what made a fighter pilot effective. The site's success also highlighted uncomfortable truths about training and selection. The traditional path to becoming a successful fighter pilot emphasized natural ability, exceptional hand-eye coordination, spatial awareness, and the ability to make split-second decisions under stress. These traits were thought to be largely innate, identifiable through testing and training, and difficult to develop in those who didn't naturally possess them. The A1CM suggested that technology could compensate for variation in natural ability, raising the floor of average performance even if it didn't raise the ceiling of exceptional performance. This had implications for how air forces should recruit and train fighter pilots. If technological systems could make average pilots perform like exceptional ones, should resources be devoted to finding and training the exceptional few, or to equipping and training average pilots with the best possible systems? The answer, as the Air Force discovered, was both. Exceptional pilots using advanced systems were even more effective than exceptional pilots without them, while average pilots with good systems were far more effective than average pilots without them. Technology didn't replace talent, it multiplied it. The A1CM's introduction also revealed how slowly military organizations adapt to change, even when the evidence supporting that change is overwhelming. The site's advantages were apparent in controlled testing as early as 1950, yet it took 2 years of combat operations before it was fully embraced in theater. This lag between evidence and adoption is characteristic of military innovation. Institutional conservatism, risk aversion, and cultural resistance can delay the adoption of superior technologies even when lives are at stake. Some of this conservatism is actually beneficial. Militaries must be cautious about unproven technologies because the costs of failure are measured in lives. New systems need extensive testing, not just of their best-case performance, but of their reliability under stress, their failure modes, and their interaction with existing equipment and doctrine. The A1CM's initial reliability problems validated the skeptics' concerns and demonstrated that early enthusiasm for new technology can be as dangerous as blanket resistance. The optimal approach, which the Air Force eventually adopted, was one of rigorous testing combined with openness to evidence. Skepticism about new technology is healthy, but that skepticism must be based on empirical results rather than preconceptions. When the evidence showed that the A1CM worked and worked well, continued resistance became indefensible. The pilots and commanders who adapted quickly gained significant advantages. Those who resisted adaptation put themselves and their units at increased risk. Looking at the broader implications, the A1CM represented an early step toward what would become a defining trend in late 20th and early 21st century warfare: the increasing centrality of information processing and computing power. Modern combat aircraft are fundamentally flying computer systems with weapons attached. The aircraft's performance is mediated through flight computers, its sensors are managed by signal processing computers, its weapons are guided by targeting computers, and its situational awareness is provided by networked information systems. This raises a troubling question. At what point does increasing automation cross a line where human judgment is no longer central to combat effectiveness? The A1CM automated ballistic calculations but left all tactical decision-making to the pilot. Modern systems automate much more. raising concerns about whether pilots are becoming managers of automated systems rather than warriors directly engaging the enemy. These concerns echo the debates about the A1CM, but on a much larger scale. There are also questions about asymmetry and fairness. The A1CM gave American pilots a significant technological advantage over their opponents. Chinese and North Korean pilots, flying aircraft without computing sights, were at a substantial disadvantage in engagements against F-86. This technological edge was a deliberate strategic choice. The United States invested heavily in developing advanced systems that would multiply the effectiveness of its forces. But it meant that air combat in Korea was not a pure test of pilot skill, but a contest between different levels of technological capability. This pattern has repeated throughout subsequent conflicts. Technological superiority has been a consistent American strategy, and computing gun sights were just the beginning. Modern American fighters have advantages in radar, weapons, communications, and situational awareness so overwhelming that engagements are often one-sided. This raises ethical questions about the nature of combat when one side has such decisive technological advantages. It also raises strategic questions about what happens when adversaries gain access to equivalent technologies, eliminating the asymmetry. The A1CM story also offers lessons about how individuals respond to change. The pilots who adapted quickly to the computing sight, who overcame their initial skepticism and learned to trust the technology, gained significant advantages. Some of these pilots became aces, achieving multiple kills and distinguishing themselves in combat. The pilots who resisted longest, who clung to manual methods out of pride or habit, put themselves at greater risk and achieved fewer successes. This is a pattern that extends far beyond air combat. Those who adapt to change effectively gain advantages, while those who resist change pay costs. Yet there is also value in skepticism and resistance. The pilots who questioned the A1CM, who pointed out its limitations and demanded improvements, drove the engineers to make the system better. Blind acceptance of new technology can be as dangerous as blind resistance. The ideal is critical adoption, embracing new capabilities while maintaining awareness of their limitations and continuing to develop human skills that complement rather than duplicate technological capabilities. The experience with the A1CM also demonstrated the importance of proper training in realizing the potential of new technology. The sight itself was merely a tool. Its effectiveness depended entirely on how well pilots were trained to use it. Units that received comprehensive training on the A1CM and developed tactics optimized for its capabilities saw dramatic improvements in combat effectiveness. Units that received the technology without adequate training or tactical development saw minimal benefit. This pattern has repeated with every subsequent military technology. Hardware alone is insufficient. Proper training and doctrine are essential. Another critical lesson was the importance of field feedback in refining new systems. The initial A1CM units had problems that weren't apparent in laboratory testing or even in peacetime training. Only the harsh conditions of combat operations revealed certain failure modes and limitations. The rapid improvement in the site's reliability came from engineers receiving detailed feedback from pilots and maintenance crews in the field, then making targeted improvements to address real-world problems. This feedback loop between operational users and system developers became a model for future technology development programs. The computing gunsight's success also influenced how the military thought about technology procurement and development. Before Korea, there was a tendency to think of aircraft as complete systems delivered from the factory. The A1CM demonstrated that aircraft could and should be continuously improved through the integration of new subsystems. This led to a more modular approach to fighter design, where major systems like radar, fire control, and avionics could be upgraded independently of the basic airframe. The F-4 Phantom, which entered service a decade after Korea, exemplified this approach with its highly modular design that allowed for continuous capability improvements throughout its service life. The winter of 1953 brought the final season of intensive air combat over Korea. By this point, the F-86 Sabre, with its A1CM computing gun sight, had established clear air superiority over MiG Alley. The kill ratios, whatever the exact figures might have been, heavily favored the Americans. Chinese and North Korean pilots had become cautious, avoiding engagement unless they had overwhelming advantages in numbers or position. Soviet pilots, more skilled and aggressive, had been largely withdrawn, their government unwilling to risk the diplomatic consequences of their presence becoming undeniable. The computing gunsight had done what its designers promised. It had transformed the effectiveness of American fighter pilots. What had once required exceptional skill and luck, hitting a maneuvering jet aircraft at high speed, had become routine for pilots who trusted the technology and mastered its use. The Sabre's 6 .50 caliber machine guns, once considered inadequate for jet combat, were now deadly effective when guided by the A1CM's precision. But the sight's impact extended far beyond the immediate tactical advantages it provided. It had fundamentally changed the nature of air combat and set patterns that would shape military aviation for decades to come. The integration of radar, computing power, and weapon systems became the template for all subsequent fighter aircraft. The trend toward increasing automation in combat systems, toward using technology to handle tasks beyond human capability, while freeing human operators to focus on tactical decision-making, was established in the skies over Korea. The pilots who flew with the A1CM became evangelists for technological innovation in military systems. Returning to the United States after their tours, they brought with them hard-won lessons about the value of computing gun sights and the importance of training pilots to use such systems effectively. Their influence shaped the development of the next generation of fighters, the F-100 Super Sabre, the F-104 Starfighter, the F-4 Phantom. Each of these aircraft featured increasingly sophisticated fire control systems descended from the principles established by the A1CM. The computing gunsight also changed how air forces thought about pilot selection and training. The traditional emphasis on finding individuals with exceptional natural ability remained, but it was supplemented by a recognition that technology could amplify the abilities of average pilots. Training programs evolved to incorporate extensive instruction on systems management, on understanding and working with complex electronic equipment, on trusting computer-generated solutions even when they contradicted instinct. The fighter pilot of the jet age was as much a systems operator as a warrior, required to master technology as well as tactics. For the individuals who experienced the transition from skepticism to acceptance, the A1CM represented a personal transformation as well as a tactical one. Pilots who had built their confidence on manual skills, who took pride in their ability to estimate deflection by eye and instinct, had to humble themselves and learn new ways. Some never fully made the transition, remaining adequate but not exceptional. Others embraced the change completely and found that the computing sight made them more effective than they had ever been with manual methods. The aces who emerged from the Korean War using the A1CM became legends not just for their kill scores, but for their willingness to adapt. They understood that effectiveness in combat required shedding preconceptions and using whatever tools worked best. This adaptive mindset, as much as the technology itself, was their real advantage. They were willing to be students again, to admit that their old methods were insufficient, and to learn new approaches even when those approaches challenged their self-image. Major Frederick Blesse, who achieved 9 kills and wrote an influential tactical manual based on his combat experience, emphasized the importance of the A1CM in his writing. Blesse's manual, No Guts, No Glory, became required reading for fighter pilots and devoted extensive coverage to proper computing gun sight employment. Blesse argued that the sight didn't reduce the need for courage or skill. It changed where that courage and skill needed to be applied. Instead of instinctive shooting, the modern fighter pilot needed courage to press attacks into effective range and hold position despite enemy fire, plus the skill to maneuver smoothly and precisely to maximize the sight's effectiveness. In the broader sweep of military history, the A1CM computing gun sight occupies a modest place. It was not a war-winning technology like radar or the atomic bomb. It did not revolutionize warfare the way tanks or aircraft carriers did, but it represented something equally important: the moment when electronic computing entered the combat aircraft cockpit and began the process that would lead to the sophisticated fighters of today. Every modern fighter pilot, sitting in a cockpit filled with screens and computers, flying an aircraft controlled by digital systems, and attacking targets designated by sophisticated sensors, is the inheritor of the lessons learned over MiG Alley. The computing gun sight showed that machines could handle certain tasks better than humans, that technology was not a crutch, but a multiplier, and that the successful warrior was not the one who rejected innovation, but the one who mastered it. The pilots who initially dismissed the A1CM as unnecessary or unreliable learned a hard lesson. In warfare, effectiveness matters more than tradition. The methods that worked yesterday may be obsolete today, and survival requires constant adaptation. Those who cling to old ways out of pride or habit will be defeated by those who embrace change and master new capabilities. This lesson, learned in the cold skies above Korea, remains as relevant today as it was 70 years ago. The secret site that changed MiG Alley was never really secret. It was evaluated, tested, and documented in official reports. What made it seem secret was that the pilots who needed it most couldn't see its value until they were forced to confront the evidence of its effectiveness. The real secret was one that humans have struggled with throughout history: the secret of letting go of what we know, admitting that there might be better ways, and having the courage to trust new methods even when they feel wrong. In the end, the A1CM dominated MiG Alley not in days but in months. Months of grudging acceptance, incremental improvements, and mounting evidence that finally overwhelmed resistance. But once that dominance was established, it was absolute and enduring. The pilots who flew with the computing site in Korea helped win air superiority in that conflict. More importantly, they established principles and patterns that would guide military aviation into the jet age and beyond. The legacy of the A1CM is visible every time a pilot trusts a computer-generated targeting solution, every time a fire control system calculates a ballistic trajectory faster and more accurately than a human could, every time technology and human skill combine to achieve results neither could accomplish alone. The site itself is long obsolete, replaced by systems that would seem like magic to the pilots of 1952. But the fundamental insight it represented, that warfare in the technological age requires embracing innovation while maintaining human judgment, remains as vital as ever. The men who flew F-86 Sabres over Korea with A1CM computing gun sights were pioneers, though most would have rejected the label. They were fighter pilots doing their jobs, trying to survive and prevail in combat. But in learning to trust the sight, in overcoming their skepticism and mastering the technology, they opened the door to the future of air combat. They showed that humans and machines could work together, each doing what it did best, to achieve results beyond what either could accomplish alone. That lesson, learned over the frozen landscape of North Korea in the crucible of jet combat, echoes down through the decades to the present day. It speaks to every pilot, every soldier, every warrior facing new technology and new methods. It says, be skeptical, but be open. Test thoroughly, but accept evidence. Hold to what works, but be willing to let go when something better comes along. And above all, remember that effectiveness in combat requires constant adaptation, constant learning, and the courage to change when change is needed. The A1CM computing gun sight dominated MiG Alley because the pilots who used it, after initial resistance and doubt, learned to trust the technology and use it skillfully. In doing so, they wrote a chapter in the history of aerial warfare that continues to shape how we think about the relationship between human capability and technological enhancement. Their story is not just about a device that improved gun accuracy. It is about the eternal challenge of adaptation, the difficulty of change, and the ultimate triumph of effectiveness over tradition. The transformation that occurred in the skies over Korea between 1951 and 1953 was not merely technical, but cultural. An entire warrior community confronted its assumptions about skill, courage, and effectiveness, and emerged changed. The fighter pilots who returned from Korea brought with them not just combat experience, but a new understanding of what it meant to be effective in modern warfare. They had learned that embracing technology didn't diminish their warrior spirit, but enhanced it, allowing them to be more lethal, more effective, and more successful in their mission. This cultural shift rippled through the Air Force and beyond, influencing how all military services thought about technology and training. The lesson was clear: technological innovation must be accompanied by cultural adaptation, or its potential will never be fully realized. The hardware is only half the equation. The other half is creating an institutional culture that values innovation, rewards adaptation, and constantly seeks better ways to accomplish the mission. As the armistice brought an uneasy peace to Korea in July 1953, the final tallies were calculated. American pilots had achieved air superiority decisively, shooting down hundreds of enemy aircraft, while losing far fewer of their own. The exact ratios remain disputed, but the outcome was never in doubt. The F-86 Sabre, guided by its revolutionary computing gunsight, had proven itself the superior weapons system in the world's first jet-versus-jet air war. More significantly, the Korean War had served as a laboratory for technologies and tactics that would define the jet age. The A1CM computing gunsight, initially dismissed by the very pilots it was designed to help, had proven its worth beyond any doubt. It had saved lives, multiplied effectiveness, and established patterns that would endure for generations. The sight's success was a victory not just for American engineering, but for open-mindedness, empiricism, and the willingness to change when confronted with evidence. In the decades that followed, as fighter aircraft became increasingly sophisticated and technology continued to advance at an accelerating pace, the fundamental dynamic established by the A1CM remained constant. Each new generation of pilots had to navigate the same tension between traditional skills and technological enhancement, between trust in their own abilities and trust in their systems. And each generation, like the Korean War pilots before them, learned that the answer was not either-or but both-and, human skill enhanced by technology, creating capabilities beyond what either could achieve alone. The story of the A1CM computing gunsight is ultimately a story about human adaptability, about our capacity to overcome our own resistance to change when necessity demands it. It reminds us that the greatest obstacles to innovation are often not technical but cultural, not in our tools but in ourselves, and it shows us that when we can overcome those obstacles, when we can set aside pride and preconception to embrace what works, we can achieve results that transform not just battles but entire domains of human endeavor.